My son Derek was hospitalized after what I was told was a horrific car accident. While pacing the intensive care hallway, I noticed an elderly woman in the next room who never had a single visitor. I started bringing her half my breakfast every morning just to be decent. On the day she was abruptly discharged, she grabbed my wrist with terrifying strength, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered, "Run away from him now." Before I tell you the rest of this chilling story, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the most dangerous people in our lives are the ones sitting right at our own dinner tables. Now let me explain exactly how a proud father who spent his entire life building a legacy ended up staring into a nightmare. It started at 2:14 in the morning. That is the kind of hour where a ringing phone never brings good news, only tragedy. The voice on the other end belonged to a police dispatcher. My son was in a severe crash. I threw on my heavy work boots, grabbed my truck keys, and took Interstate 95 like a man possessed. I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years of my life as a commercial building contractor. I poured concrete framed houses and broke my back day in and day out, so my son would never have to struggle. My beautiful wife, Martha, passed away 3 years ago after a long, painful battle with illness. That loss left Derek as the only real family I had remaining in this world. Driving at 80 miles an hour through the pitch-black night, the highway lines blurring together, all I could hear was Martha's final whisper, making me promise to look after our boy. Derek used to be a good kid. A bit too ambitious, perhaps always chasing the next big dollar, but he had a conscience. That slowly changed when he married Monica. She was a corporate shark, a woman who seemed to measure a person's worth entirely by their net assets and luxury cars. When Derek started his own company, Caldwell Property Management, I was incredibly proud. I thought he was building a legitimate, honorable legacy. I even loaned him the massive seed money from my own hard-earned retirement savings. But over the last few years, his tailored suits got sharper, his sports cars got faster, and his visits to his old man became shorter and incredibly superficial. The tires of my truck screeched loudly as I pulled into the emergency parking lot of Mercy General Hospital. The automatic sliding doors parted, and immediately that sterile chemical smell of harsh antiseptic hit the back of my throat. It is a smell you never forget. It smells like fear. I bypassed the front desk entirely, ignoring the tired receptionist calling after me, and frantically followed the red-painted lines on the floor leading straight to the intensive care unit. My chest was heaving. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I fully expected to hear the chaotic symphony of trauma doctors shouting orders, the frantic beeping of heart monitors, and the desperate, hysterical cries of a wife terrified of losing her husband. Instead, when I rounded the corner to Derek's assigned room, I hit a solid brick wall. It was Monica. My daughter-in-law stood squarely in the center of the doorway, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She did not look like a woman whose husband was fighting for his life. There were no tear streaks ruining her expensive makeup. Her hair was perfectly pinned back, not a strand out of place. Her eyes, those pale, calculating green eyes I had always found deeply unsettling, held absolutely no panic. She looked exactly like a hired security guard posted outside a bank vault. "Dad, stop right there." Her voice was firm, icy, and completely devoid of the hysterical tremor you would naturally expect from a grieving spouse. I tried to step around her, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "Let me see my boy, Monica. Move out of the way. I need to see him." She shifted her weight, physically blocking the narrow gap of the doorframe. "You cannot go in there. The doctors are very clear about this." She kept her voice exceptionally low, a harsh, controlled whisper that felt entirely out of place in a chaotic emergency ward. A drunk driver ran a red light and completely T-boned his SUV. The impact was brutal. He has massive internal bleeding and severe cranial swelling. They had to put him in a medically induced coma just to stabilize his brain activity. She recited the medical terms with the cold, detached efficiency of someone reading from a rehearsed grocery list. "They have strictly forbidden all visitors, Dad. His immune system is completely compromised right now. Any outside bacteria could cause a lethal infection. You need to go sit in the waiting room. I stared at her, trying to process the nightmare she was describing. My strong 42-year-old son, the wealthy CEO of his own firm, broken and comatose. The primal instinct of any father is to push through a physical barrier to reach his child. But I stopped. I froze right there in the hallway. Because something about the scene playing out in front of me felt structurally unsound. When you spend 4 decades inspecting building foundations and framing, you learn to spot the hairline cracks that other people walk right past. You learn that when a load-bearing wall does not look flush, the entire house is ready to collapse. I looked at Monica again, really looked at her. The police dispatcher had explicitly told me they called her at home, waking her up from a dead sleep just 20 minutes before they called me. Yet here she was in a tailored charcoal blazer and pressed silk slacks, looking like she was ready to close $1 million real estate deal. But it was not her immaculate outfit that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was her left cuff. Right on the edge of the crisp white silk protruding from her dark blazer sleeve, there was a dark, rust-colored smear. Dried blood. I stared at it, my mind racing to put the pieces together. Monica, if the police called you at home while you were sound asleep, how did you get here so fast? I asked, my voice dropping a full octave. I rushed. I grabbed the first thing I saw and drove straight here, she answered instantly, without missing a single beat. I pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at her wrist. Then, whose blood is that on your sleeve? Because if you just got here from your warm bed and the doctors will not let you inside the ICU room to see your comatose husband. How exactly did you get someone's dried blood onto your clothes? For the very first time that night, the cold, impenetrable security guard facade slipped. Her green eyes darted down to the stain, and I saw a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic. She pulled her arm back quickly, tucking the wrist tightly behind her back. I bumped into a trauma nurse in the hallway. She stammered, the smooth, rehearsed confidence suddenly evaporating from her voice. The nurse was rushing out of another room. She had blood on her scrubs. We collided. It was just a frantic accident. I felt a freezing chill run straight down my spine. That was a lie. A blatant, desperate, poorly constructed lie. In a modern American hospital like Mercy General, nurses do not sprint through the public hallways covered in wet, transferable blood. They wear protective gowns. They strictly strip them off before ever leaving a trauma room to prevent biohazard contamination. It is an absolute medical protocol. A nurse covered in blood would never carelessly collide with a visitor in a sterile hallway. If she was lying about the blood, it meant she was already in the car when the crash happened. Or far worse, she was lying about the crash entirely. I did not call her out on the lie right then and there. If you find a massive crack in a foundation, you do not take a sledgehammer to it immediately. You take a step back. You silently assess the damage. You figure out what is holding the roof up before you start tearing down the walls. Okay, I said softly, intentionally, letting my shoulders slump, playing the exact part of the exhausted, overwhelmed, clueless old man she clearly expected me to be. I am just so worried about him, Monica. If I lose him too after losing my Martha, I honestly do not know what I will do. I watched her face incredibly carefully. A brief, unmistakable flicker of arrogant relief washed over her features. The tight tension in her jaw relaxed. I know, Dad, she said, her voice suddenly dripping with that manufactured toxic sympathy I had always hated. We just have to trust the brilliant doctors. Why do not you go get a hot coffee from the cafeteria? I promise I will come find you if his status changes. I nodded slowly, turning away from the closed, guarded door of my son's room. I walked heavily down the long, linoleum-tiled corridor, my work boots squeaking against the polished surface. Every single instinct screaming inside my head told me to turn around, kick that heavy door open, and see exactly what was happening in that room. But the dried blood on her sleeve told a completely different story. A much darker, terrifying story. As I walked toward the waiting area, I passed by the adjacent room, room 402. The heavy wooden door was propped open just a few inches. I casually glanced inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by the harsh, rhythmic blue glow of a standard heart monitor. In the dead center of the hospital bed lay a frail, elderly woman. Her thin silver hair was stark against the white pillow. There were no cheerful get-well-soon balloons on the windowsill, no framed family photos on the bedside table, no relatives holding her hand in the lonely, terrifying hours of the early morning. Just a profound, heavy, suffocating isolation. She was wide awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, with an expression of sheer, unspoken terror. I did not know it at that precise moment, but that lonely woman in room 402, Sylvia Bennett, was the master key to unraveling a nightmare that would nearly destroy everything I had left. The puzzle pieces were already laid out before me. The strange midnight call, the uninjured but highly defensive daughter-in-law, the impossible bloodstain, and the medically induced coma that so conveniently kept everyone away. The dominoes were lined up and they were just about to fall. The heavy thud of the hospital doors closing behind me felt like a physical blow. Monica had not just lied to me. She had me removed. Within moments of my questioning the dried blood on her designer sleeve, her entire demeanor had violently shifted. She did not argue. Instead, she let out a perfectly timed theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands, just as two hospital security guards turned the corner. She pointed a trembling finger at me, claiming the grief was making me aggressive, that I was disrupting the critical care environment her husband desperately needed. The guards did not listen to my protests. They placed their firm hands on my shoulders and escorted me out of the intensive care wing like a common trespasser. The humiliation burned in my chest, a hot ember, but it was quickly overshadowed by a rapidly solidifying dread. I found myself banished to a rigid plastic bench in a secondary waiting area positioned just outside a standard observation room down the hall. Room 402. I slumped against the unforgiving wall, the adrenaline of the midnight drive fading, leaving only an exhausted, hollow ache. I spent hours staring at the scuffed linoleum tiles, replaying Monica's flawless lie and the terrifying calmness in her pale green eyes. As the agonizingly slow night stretched on, my attention drifted to the open doorway of room 402. The room was stark, bathed in the sickly fluorescent glow of a single overhead light. There was an elderly woman in the bed, looking small and fragile under the thin hospital blanket. What struck me was the profound, suffocating emptiness of her space. In a hospital, even in the dead of night, you see signs of a life lived outside those walls. A stray balloon, a stack of greeting cards, a forgotten sweater draped over a visitor chair. This room had nothing. It was entirely stripped of personal history, as if the woman inside had simply ceased to exist to the outside world. I watched the nurses routinely walk past her door, completely ignoring her, treating the room as if it were simply a storage closet. When the first pale rays of dawn broke through the tall glass windows at the end of the corridor, the hospital shifted into its daytime rhythm. Carts rattled, intercoms chimed, and the night shift gave way to the morning staff. I pushed myself up from the rigid bench, my old joints popping in protest. I needed terrible hospital coffee just to keep my eyes open, to keep my mind sharp enough to figure out what to do next. I walked down to the main cafeteria, purchasing a large black coffee and a heavy bran muffin. As I walked back to my makeshift post, I glanced again into room 402. The elderly woman was awake. She was staring at the ceiling with an expression of such hollow, paralyzing fear that it stopped me dead in my tracks. I remembered Martha's final days in a similar bed. How much a simple human voice had meant to her when the pain became too loud. I took a deep breath, gently pushed the door open a few more inches, and stepped inside. She flinched violently at the sound of my work boots against the floor, shrinking back against the pillows. I immediately raised my hands in a calming gesture, offering a gentle, tired smile. "I am not a doctor," I said softly, keeping my voice low and steady. "I am just a father waiting for his son. I brought a muffin, and it is far too big for me." I thought you might want half." The woman blinked, her pale, papery skin stretching tight over her cheekbones. She looked at the muffin, then up at me, her eyes darting frantically toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to rush in and punish her. When no one came, she slowly nodded. I pulled a plastic chair close to her bedside, broke the muffin in two, and handed her a piece on a napkin. She ate it with a desperate hunger that broke my heart. She told me her name was Sylvia. Sylvia Bennett. Her voice was raspy, dry as cracked leaves. I asked her if she was waiting for family to arrive. The moment the word family left my lips, a dark shadow passed over her face. Her breathing quickened, the heart monitor beside her bed spiking with a sudden erratic rhythm. "They do not know I am here," she whispered, her eyes wide and panicked. "He took my phone. He took everything away." I frowned, leaning closer, my protective instincts flaring up. "Who took your things, Sylvia? Who did this to you?" I asked, my tone dropping to a serious, grounded register. I thought of my own son lying supposedly comatose just down the hall and the inexplicable blood on my daughter-in-law's cuff. My family was unraveling, and here was a stranger entirely unspooled. "It is only polite to introduce myself," I continued, hoping to build trust. "My name is Harrison. Harrison Caldwell. I am waiting for my boy Derek." Derek Caldwell. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely terrifying. The second the name Derek Caldwell hung in the quiet air of the hospital room, all the blood drained from Sylvia Bennett's face. The frail, terrified woman vanished, replaced by an animalistic desperation. She lunged forward with a physical strength that defied her fragile frame. Her bony fingers clamped down onto my wrist like a steel vise. Her fingernails dug painfully deep into my skin, tearing through the top layer. The muffin dropped from her other hand, crumbling onto the white sheets. "You are his father," she hissed, her voice trembling with a raw, unfiltered horror that chilled me to the marrow of my bones. "Run. Run away from him while you still can. Run away from him right now to escape." Before I could even process the sheer terror in her raspy warning, before I could ask why my son's name triggered such panic, a heavy footstep echoed sharply from the hallway. A massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a tailored black suit barged directly into room 402. He did not knock. He moved with the entitled, ruthless authority of someone who owned the entire building. His cold, dead eyes locked onto me, assessing the situation in a fraction of a second. He marched straight to the large window, forcefully yanking the privacy blinds completely shut with a harsh snap. The sudden darkness in the room felt incredibly oppressive. He turned slowly to face me, glaring with open hostility. "You need to leave this room immediately, old man," he commanded, his deep voice leaving zero room for negotiation. But as he stepped closer, the fluorescent light caught a gleaming reflection on the wide lapel of his expensive suit. It was a customized silver pin shaped into a very specific, unmistakable corporate logo. A crest that I knew intimately. My son's company. The terrifying reality hit me hard like a runaway freight train, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. The true nightmare had officially just begun for me. I did not argue with the towering man in the dark suit. Contractor rule number 1 is that you never fight a loaded, compromised structural beam without proper support, or the entire ceiling will inevitably collapse right on top of you. I simply raised my hands in a gesture of surrender and slowly backed out of room 402. My eyes firmly locked on that gleaming silver lapel pin until the heavy wooden door finally clicked shut in my face. My mind was immediately spinning wildly out of control, desperately trying to piece together a terrifying, incomprehensible jigsaw puzzle. Why in the world was a corporate employee from Caldwell Property Management acting as a hostile bouncer for a terrified 82-year-old woman in an intensive care hospital wing? The situation defied all logic and reason. I needed concrete answers right away, and the only person in this sprawling building who could possibly give them to me was the woman currently guarding my son's hospital room. I marched briskly down the sterile corridor, my heavy work boots thudding against the shiny floors. I checked the main waiting area hoping to find her sitting among the worn-out chairs, but Monica was entirely gone. I spent the next 10 minutes systematically searching the surrounding hallways until I finally located her down in the hospital cafeteria on the ground floor. She was sitting alone at a secluded corner table by a large window, tapping furiously and methodically on the screen of her expensive smartphone. A pristine, steaming cup of untouched green tea sat right in front of her. Watching her from a distance, she did not look like a devastated woman keeping a tragic vigil for a comatose husband whose life hung in the balance. She looked exactly like a ruthless corporate executive actively managing a highly sensitive, hostile business takeover. I walked over, pulled out the harsh metal chair directly across from her, and sat down heavily, letting out an exhausted breath. Monica did not even bother to look up from her glowing screen. Her perfectly manicured thumbs continued to fly across the digital keyboard with practiced speed. "Who is the large man in the black suit currently guarding room 402? I asked intentionally, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady, to avoid attracting the attention of the tired doctors and nurses sitting a few tables away from us. Monica's fingers immediately stopped moving. She slowly locked her phone, placed it face down on the table, and finally raised her pale green eyes to meet mine. In an instant, her expression morphed seamlessly into one of profound, overwhelming exhaustion. She let out a long, heavy theatrical sigh, reaching up to gently rub her temples, as if my mere presence was giving her a debilitating migraine. "Dad, please," she murmured, her voice dripping with a carefully practiced, tragic fatigue. "I am dealing with more than enough right now. Your son, my husband, is fighting for his very life upstairs in a hospital bed. Do we really need to do this right now? Can you not just let me have 5 minutes of peace?" I just asked a very simple, straightforward question, I pressed, absolutely refusing to let her deflect the conversation or play the victim card. "A massive man wearing your husband's corporate logo just threatened me and threw me out of a terrified elderly woman's hospital room. I simply want to know why a property management firm has muscle stationed in an intensive care unit." Monica leaned forward across the small table, lowering her voice even further, expertly adopting the patronizing tone of a patient schoolteacher, explaining a highly complex concept to a very slow child. "His name is Gregory Dad. He is not a security guard or some kind of corporate muscle. He is a specialized insurance adjuster. That frail woman upstairs is Sylvia Bennett. Derek personally manages her massive estate. She is currently suffering from severe, advanced, and highly aggressive dementia. She had a terrible, violent break-in at her home a few days ago, which is exactly why she is recovering here in the hospital. Her mind is completely gone. Dad. She gets extremely paranoid, highly delusional, and fiercely aggressive with strangers. Gregory is simply there to ensure her remaining assets are protected and that nobody tries to take advantage of her while she is in this incredibly vulnerable mental state." The explanation sounded so perfectly constructed, so logically flawless, and so deeply plausible. It was a solid, seemingly impenetrable alibi, delivered with remarkable conviction. If I were any other grieving father blinded by the stress of my son's tragic accident, I might have just nodded blindly, apologized profusely for overreacting, and offered to buy her a fresh cup of tea. But I vividly remembered the desperate, piercing clarity in Sylvia Bennett's tear-filled eyes. I knew that dementia patients might be horribly confused or disoriented by their surroundings, but terror, like that pure, visceral, bone-chilling terror, simply cannot be faked or attributed to a failing memory. Furthermore, corporate insurance adjusters absolutely do not act like hardened mafia enforcers ready to break an old man's jaw just for offering half a bran muffin. I nodded slowly, intentionally, softening my posture, putting my clueless, tired old man mask firmly back into place. I mumbled quietly, looking down at my calloused hands. "I am sorry, Monica. I just got confused and worried, that is all. The stress is getting to my head. I will definitely leave the poor woman alone so she can rest." I pushed my chair back, stood up with a deliberate groan, and walked away, pretending to head toward the main lobby exit to get some fresh air. I could practically feel Monica's arrogant, satisfied gaze burning into my back as I retreated. But the very moment I was safely out of her line of sight, I spun around and doubled back to the hidden staff elevator bank. I jammed my finger against the call button, my heart hammering violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. I desperately needed to speak to Sylvia again. I needed to know exactly why the mere mention of my son's name made her look like she was staring directly into the eyes of the Grim Reaper himself. The elevator chimed loudly, and I stepped out onto the 4th floor, walking purposefully and quickly toward room 402. I fully expected Gregory to be standing right there in the doorway, cracking his knuckles and ready to physically throw me down the hall again. But the long corridor was completely empty. I cautiously approached the heavy wooden door and gently pushed it open. The hospital room was terrifyingly vacant. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was silent. The mechanical bed was stripped bare down to the plastic mattress. The blankets and pillows were gone. A young nurse holding a clipboard walked briskly past the open doorway. "Excuse me, miss," I said. "Where did Mrs. Bennett go?" The nurse checked her list. She was formally discharged an hour ago by her legal guardian. The timing was chilling. My son was truly hunting her. The timing was chilling. My son was truly hunting her. I stood in the empty corridor, my mind racing with 100 terrifying scenarios. I needed to get inside Derek's room. I needed to see the condition of my boy with my own 2 eyes to understand just how deep this deception went. Fate, it seemed, was entirely on my side. Suddenly, a blaring alarm echoed from the far end of the intensive care unit. A code blue was called over the overhead speaker system. Every nurse and doctor in the immediate vicinity rushed past me toward the crisis, their rubber soles squeaking frantically on the polished floor. I glanced toward the waiting area. Monica was standing near the vending machines, her back turned to me, deeply engrossed in a hushed, intense phone call. Gregory, her corporate muscle, was completely gone, likely overseeing Sylvia Bennett's forced relocation to whatever black site facility they had condemned her to. The heavy door to room 412, Derek's room, was completely unguarded. I did not hesitate. I pushed the heavy door open and slipped silently into the darkened room, letting the latch click softly shut behind me. The room was bathed in the dim, artificial glow of medical monitors. I braced myself for the horrific sight Monica had described. A shattered body, massive cranial swelling, life support tubes keeping my only son tethered to this earth. I walked to the edge of the bed and looked down. My breath caught in my throat, not from grief, but from profound, burning confusion. Derek was lying perfectly still, his eyes closed in deep sleep. But there were no casts on his limbs. There were no thick bandages wrapping his head. His face, the face I had washed and kissed 1,000 times when he was a boy, was completely flawless. There was not a single bruise, scratch, or laceration to be seen. I looked up at the digital heart monitor, positioned next to his bed. His heart rate was a steady, rhythmic 65 beats per minute. The oxygen saturation was perfect. He was not on a bulky mechanical ventilator breathing for him. He only had a simple, thin plastic nasal tube resting lightly beneath his nostrils. The sheer absurdity of the scene washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. A man who had just been brutally T-boned by a drunk driver does not lie in a hospital bed looking like he just returned from a relaxing spa retreat. There was absolutely no medically induced coma. My son was simply taking a quiet afternoon nap in an outrageously expensive hospital suite. The crash was a complete fabrication. The medical quarantine was a highly calculated shield designed specifically to keep me and anyone else from asking questions. My sadness instantly evaporated completely, replaced by a hot, radiating anger. If Derek was faking a catastrophic near-fatal accident, he was doing it for a highly specific reason. He needed to be inside this exact hospital. He needed unrestricted access to this medical environment. I slowly backed away from the bed, my eyes scanning the sterile room for any clue, any piece of physical evidence that could explain this elaborate stage play. That was when I saw it. Shoved hastily beneath the cheap dark blue vinyl visitor sofa in the corner of the room was a sleek, black Italian leather briefcase. It was Derek's signature briefcase. He carried it to every family dinner, treating it like it contained state secrets. I dropped to my knees, my old joints screaming in protest, and dragged the heavy leather bag out from under the sofa. It was secured by two thick brass combination locks. Monica and Derek clearly thought I was just a clueless, grieving old man who would never dare to snoop. They vastly underestimated the skills of a man who spent 40 years on commercial construction sites. When you spend decades installing, breaking, and repairing heavy-duty commercial deadbolts, a cheap luggage lock is absolutely nothing. I reached into my denim pocket and pulled out my heavy keychain. Attached to it was a small, rigid piece of tension wire I always used for quick sight measurements. I slid the wire directly into the tiny gap beside the first brass dial, applying upward pressure while slowly rotating the numbers. I felt for the subtle mechanical click of the internal cylinder falling into the correct alignment. Within 40 seconds, both brass latches sprang open with a sharp, satisfying snap. I flipped the leather lid back, expecting to find standard real estate contracts, commercial property deeds, or basic tenant agreements. Instead, my calloused hands pulled out thick stacks of heavily notarized legal documents that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. There were absolutely no property management portfolios. The entire briefcase was packed to the brim with irrevocable power of attorney transfers, aggressive asset liquidation orders, and highly restrictive court-mandated guardianship approvals. I rapidly flipped through the heavy manila folders, my eyes scanning the bold black ink. Every single file belonged to a different elderly citizen. There were medical evaluations signed by a Dr. Aris, officially declaring each individual entirely mentally incompetent and suffering from advanced aggressive dementia. Attached to these fraudulent medical evaluations were immediate transfer deeds, effectively handing over their beautiful homes, their lifetime savings, and their complete legal autonomy directly to Caldwell Property Management. My son was not managing these people's estates. He was actively stealing them. He was using corrupt, fabricated medical diagnoses to systematically strip vulnerable seniors of their fundamental human rights. I dug deeper into the leather briefcase, my hands shaking violently as the horrific scale of his criminal enterprise became undeniably clear. Toward the very bottom of the stack, I found a brand new, pristine white folder. Across the front tab, printed in bold, unmistakable letters, was a name that made my stomach aggressively turn. Sylvia Bennett, Complete Liquidation. I opened the file. Inside was a recently signed document legally transferring ownership of her entire estate, her bank accounts, and her personal property over to a shell corporation. Attached to the back was a formal medical directive authorizing her permanent transfer to a closed-door, high-security psychiatric ward. The order was signed by the exact same Dr. Aris, executed just a few hours ago. Derek had not been injured in a tragic accident. He was using this specific intensive care unit as a hunting ground. He was perfectly positioned to identify vulnerable, isolated elderly patients who had no family visitors. He and Monica would then fabricate dementia diagnoses, forge the necessary legal signatures, and quietly erase these innocent people from society to steal their life savings. The heavy realization crashed down on my shoulders, nearly suffocating me. The son I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my entire body to protect and provide for, was a ruthless, calculating monster. He was preying on the absolute weakest members of our society. I closed Sylvia's file, placing it exactly where I found it. I secured the brass latches and shoved the dark briefcase far back under the vinyl sofa. I stood up slowly, looking at my son's peaceful face. The rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, completely unassisted by machines, sickened me. I was looking at a predator resting between hunts. I quietly backed out of the intensive care room, carefully clicking the heavy door shut. I kept my head down, pulling the brim of my cap low, and walked straight past the nursing station and out into the biting morning air. The sun was just beginning to burn through the gray clouds, casting long, harsh shadows across the hospital parking lot. I climbed into my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My hands, calloused from decades of framing walls and pouring concrete, were trembling violently. If Derek was orchestrating a massive, systematic theft of elderly people's assets and using corrupt doctors to legally erase them, then I was incredibly vulnerable. I was exactly the demographic his criminal enterprise preyed upon. Worse, I was the one who had funded Caldwell Property Management. I had given him the keys to the castle. My immediate thought went to my own home. I needed to secure my personal assets immediately. I shoved the key into the ignition and sped out of the lot. The drive back to my neighborhood felt like a blur. All I could think about was Martha. We had bought the empty plot of land exactly 40 years ago. I had designed the blueprints on our small kitchen table. I had personally laid every brick, driven every nail, and hung every drywall panel. I had carried her across that threshold, and years later I had held her hand in the living room as she took her final breath. That house was not just a piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my entire life. It was my sanctuary. But as I turned onto my quiet suburban street, a chilling wave of paranoia washed over me. I parked my truck in the driveway and walked up the familiar concrete path. The morning was quiet, the neighborhood completely still. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass key ring. I isolated the worn, familiar key to the front door, the one I had carried in my pocket every single day for 4 decades. I reached out to slide it into the brass deadbolt lock. My hand stopped in midair. The heavy brass deadbolt was completely gone. In its place was a sleek, matte, black, digital smart lock. A small touchscreen panel glowed ominously with a faint red light. I stared at the foreign hardware, my heart plummeting into my stomach. A contractor knows his own work intimately. I had installed the original deadbolt myself. It required specialized tools and considerable effort to remove. Someone had systematically dismantled my front door security while I was sitting in a hospital waiting room, worrying about my supposedly dying son. I reached out and touched the cold glass of the digital keypad. It beeped sharply, rejecting my touch. I was completely locked out of the house I had built with my own 2 hands. The feeling of violation was absolute. It was a visceral, suffocating wave of panic. My own home had been breached, altered, and sealed against me. I took a step back, my mind racing through the terrifying implications. If they had changed the locks, what else had they touched? What else had they taken? Before I could even begin to process a plan to bypass the digital lock, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the morning silence. A sleek black luxury SUV pulled smoothly into the driveway, parking directly behind my dusty work truck. The driver's side door opened, and Monica stepped out. She was still wearing the same tailored charcoal blazer and pressed silk slacks from the hospital. However, the cold, calculating security guard demeanor she had worn in the intensive care unit was entirely gone. She plastered a bright, incredibly warm smile across her face as she walked briskly up the driveway toward me. "Dad," she called out cheerfully, her voice practically dripping with manufactured sweetness. "I am so glad I caught you. I completely forgot to tell you about the door." I stood perfectly still on the porch, forcing my muscles to relax, forcing the boiling rage deep down into the pit of my stomach. "What about the door, Monica?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and confused. She stopped on the step below me, pulling her expensive smartphone from her pocket. "There have been several aggressive burglaries in the neighborhood over the past few weeks," she explained smoothly, shaking her head with an exaggerated look of concern. "Derek and I were so worried about your safety, especially with you living all alone here in this big house. We decided to upgrade your exterior locks to a maximum security digital system. It is much safer than a traditional key. I have the master code right here on my phone." She swiped her screen, tapped a few buttons, and the black lock on my front door chirped pleasantly, the deadbolt retracting with a smooth mechanical whir. "See, completely secure." She smiled, pushing the heavy oak door open for me. I stared at her, feeling a sick, twisting sensation in my gut. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered. I forced a grateful, relieved smile onto my face, playing the exact role she needed me to play. "Thank you, Monica," I said softly, stepping past her into the foyer. "That is very thoughtful of you and Derek. I just got so confused looking at it." She patted my shoulder affectionately. "We just want you to be safe, Dad. I am going to run into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and then I have to head back to the hospital. Take your time getting settled." I nodded and watched her walk toward the kitchen. The absolute second she disappeared around the corner, I abandoned the fragile old man routine. I moved silently and rapidly down the hallway, taking the stairs to the basement 2 at a time. I entered my private study, shutting the heavy door without making a single sound. I dropped to my knees beside my heavy oak desk and ripped back the Persian rug. The hidden floor panel was already loose. I pried it up, exposing the heavy steel door of my hidden floor safe. The digital keypad on the safe was dark. The thick steel locking bolts were completely retracted. The heavy door was sitting wide open. I reached my shaking hands inside the dark metal cavity, frantically feeling around the cold steel walls. Nothing. My retirement bonds gone. The original deed to my house gone. The stack of emergency cash I had saved for decades gone. It was completely empty. They had not just changed my locks. They had systematically stripped my entire life away. I was already a victim. The very foundation of my existence had been violently ripped out from underneath me. I was completely trapped inside a digital fortress that my own flesh and blood had quietly conquered while I was mourning his fake accident. I knelt on the cold concrete floor of my basement, staring into the dark, hollow cavity of the floor safe. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I possessed, every ounce of protective fatherly rage, screamed at me to march upstairs, grab Monica by the collar, and demand to know exactly what she and Derek had done. I wanted to tear the walls down. But a lifetime in commercial construction had hardwired a very specific discipline into my brain. Contractor rule number 2 is that you never expose a critical structural flaw to a hostile client until you already have the blueprints and the heavy machinery required to fix it. If you show your panic, they will use it to bury you. If I went upstairs and confronted Monica now, with zero proof and my assets entirely drained, I would be playing right into their hands. I had just witnessed the tip of a massive criminal iceberg. They had changed the locks. They had emptied my life savings. They had forged a catastrophic hospital stay. If they were capable of orchestrating all of that while smiling to my face, they were capable of much worse. I had to assume that I was currently standing inside a meticulously designed trap. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the hot, suffocating anger deep down into the pit of my stomach. I carefully closed the heavy steel door of the floor safe, spun the inactive dial, and folded the Persian rug back into its precise original position. I smoothed out the wrinkles in the fabric, ensuring the room looked exactly as I had found it. I stood up, dusted off my knees, and rolled my shoulders forward. I could not be Harrison Caldwell, the seasoned contractor, today. I needed to become exactly who Derek and Monica believed me to be. A frail, exhausted, grieving old man who was completely overwhelmed by the tragic circumstances of his son's horrific accident. I walked slowly up the basement stairs, intentionally making my footsteps heavy and unsteady. I let my posture slump, rounding my back to project a profound sense of defeat. When I reached the kitchen, Monica was standing by the marble island, casually pouring herself a glass of sparkling water. She turned toward me, her face instantly arranging itself into that sickeningly perfect mask of familial concern. "Did you find everything you needed, Dad?" She asked, her tone light and airy, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the hostile takeover of my entire existence. I leaned heavily against the doorframe, rubbing a trembling hand over my face. I let out a long, ragged sigh. "I am just so tired, Monica," I murmured, letting my voice crack just a fraction. I thought coming home would bring me some peace, but sitting in this house surrounded by all of Martha's things while Derek is fighting for his life in that hospital bed is just too much. It is destroying my nerves. I cannot sit still, but I cannot seem to catch my breath either. I paused, looking down at the hardwood floor playing The Broken Widower to perfection. I think I need to get away for a few days. Monica set her glass down, her posture perfectly still. Get away, where would you go? I kept my eyes fixed on the floor. Up to the old cabin at Lake George, I said quietly. Martha and I used to go there when things got too heavy. There is no television, no internet, just the water and the quiet. I think I need to spend a week up there. Just me and my fishing rod. I need to clear my head, rest my mind, and pray for my boy. I slowly lifted my head to gauge her reaction. I watched as the hook was completely eagerly swallowed. A brilliant, undeniable gleam of predatory joy flashed behind Monica's pale green eyes. It was the look of a hunter watching their prey willingly walk directly into a cage. She stepped forward, placing a warm, comforting hand on my arm. Her touch made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to lean into it. Dad, I think that is an absolutely wonderful idea, she said, her voice practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. The doctor said Derek will be in this induced coma for at least a week to let the cranial swelling reduce. There is absolutely nothing you can do here except exhaust yourself. You need to take care of your own heart right now. Going to the cabin is exactly what you should do. I will handle everything here at the hospital. Let me help you pack your things. Before I could even protest, she was ushering me toward the master bedroom. The sheer speed and efficiency with which she moved was terrifying. Within 20 minutes, she had a duffel bag filled with my flannel shirts, heavy socks, and fishing gear. As we walked back to the front door, she reached into her designer purse and pulled out a stack of $20 bills. Here, she said, pressing the money directly into my calloused hand. This is $500 in cash. The cash machines up near the lake are always broken, and I do not want you worrying about your credit cards or stopping at banks while you relax. Just use this for gas and groceries. Do not worry about a single thing here. I stared at the cash in my hand. It was an incredibly calculated move. She was giving me untraceable cash, so I would not leave a digital footprint on my bank accounts, ensuring I disappeared off the grid just as they wanted. Thank you, Monica, I whispered. You are a good daughter. She smiled that hollow, beautiful smile and opened the front door. I walked to my work truck, threw the duffel bag onto the passenger seat, and climbed behind the wheel. Monica stood on the porch, waving softly as I backed out of the driveway. I raised a trembling hand in return, keeping the facade firmly in place until I turned the corner and my house disappeared from the rearview mirror. The moment I was out of her sight, the trembling completely stopped. My slumped shoulders snapped back into a rigid posture. The facade of the broken old man evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharpened clarity. I hit the accelerator, merging onto the interstate heading north. I drove for 40 miles to put a safe distance between us. I pulled off the highway at a busy truck stop. I parked far from the overhead security cameras. I slowly pulled out my smartphone. It contained my entire digital life, but it also contained a tracking system. I powered the device down and dropped it directly into a rusted metal trash can. I walked into the convenience store using Monica's cash to purchase a cheap burner phone. I sat in my truck and stared at the glowing screen. My son had stolen my life savings. He was destroying lives while hiding behind a fabricated coma. He really thought he had won. I gripped the cheap plastic phone tightly. I was definitely not going fishing. I was going to war. I was definitely not going fishing. I was going to war. I drove for another 30 miles, pushing my heavy truck past the county line and deep into the forgotten industrial outskirts of the city. The landscape shifted from manicured suburban lawns to rusted chain-link fences and abandoned manufacturing warehouses. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Starlight Motor Inn. It was a decaying single-story concrete structure with flickering neon tubes and peeling green paint. It was exactly the kind of invisible, off-the-grid sanctuary I needed right now. I walked into the cramped, smoke-stained lobby and slapped down 2 crisp $20 bills from Monica's hypocritical care package. The bored clerk, sliding a heavy brass key across the scratched laminate counter, did not even ask for my identification. I parked my truck behind a towering, rusted dumpster to obscure my license plates from the main road and slipped into room number 7. The space was claustrophobic, smelling faintly of stale bleach and old carpets, but the heavy deadbolt on the door was solid brass and fully functional. I locked it securely, pulled the thick, light-blocking curtains shut, and sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress. I pulled the cheap plastic burner phone from my jacket pocket and carefully punched in a phone number I had memorized over a decade ago. It was time to call in the cavalry. My thumb hovered over the glowing green call button as I thought about Garrett Flynn. Garrett was a retired senior detective who had spent 30 years hunting down financial predators for the State Fraud Division. 15 years ago, Garrett had taken a bullet to the hip during a chaotic raid on a counterfeit check operation. The severe injury had forced him into early medical retirement, leaving him permanently walking with a heavy cane and drowning in unapproved medical bills. When I heard that he could not safely navigate his own house in his wheelchair during his recovery, I gathered a crew of my best commercial carpenters. We spent 3 full weeks completely gutting and remodeling his entire kitchen, expanding his doorways, and building custom wooden access ramps. We did it entirely for free. We did not accept a single dime for the labor or the materials. Garrett had shaken my hand, with tears in his eyes, promising me that if I ever found myself in a dark corner, he would be the flashlight. I pressed the call button and pressed the plastic speaker to my ear. The line rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered with a cautious greeting. "Garrett," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. "It is Harrison Caldwell. I know it has been a long time, but I am standing in a very dark corner right now, and I desperately need that flashlight." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Where are you, Harrison?" Garrett asked, his tone instantly shifting from casual retiree to hardened investigator. I gave him the address of a rundown 24-hour roadside diner located just 2 miles down the highway from my motel. I told him to meet me there in exactly 1 hour, and to bring whatever secure digital access he still had to his old precinct network. I washed my face in the rusted bathroom sink, splashed cold water on my neck to wake myself up, and drove to the diner. I slid into a cracked red vinyl booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Precisely 60 minutes later, Garrett walked through the glass doors. His hair was completely gray now, and he leaned heavily on his thick oak cane, but his dark eyes were just as sharp and piercing as they had been 15 years ago. He slid into the booth across from me, placing a heavy, reinforced black laptop on the laminated table between us. He did not bother with pleasantries. He took one look at my pale, exhausted face and simply asked what I needed him to find. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. Before I had closed the hidden briefcase under Derek's hospital sofa, I had frantically memorized the key details. I slid the napkin across the table. On it, I had written the name Sylvia Bennett, the name of Dr. Eris, and the specific shell corporation listed on the property transfer documents. I took a deep breath and told Garrett everything. I told him about the inexplicable fake accident, the aggressive corporate muscle guarding an elderly woman, the hidden briefcase stuffed with liquidation orders, and the terrifying digital lock that had just locked me out of my own home. Garrett did not interrupt me once. He simply listened, his jaw tightening with every new piece of information. When I finally finished, he picked up the napkin, opened his encrypted laptop, and began typing with practiced, methodical speed. I sat in the uncomfortable booth for over 2 hours, drinking endless cups of bitter, burnt coffee. I watched Garrett navigate through secure government databases, obscure corporate registries, and restricted medical licensing boards. His face grew darker and more grim with every passing minute. Occasionally, he would pick up his secure cell phone and make hushed urgent calls to old contacts still working inside the state fraud division. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking, a clear sign of mounting suppressed rage. Finally, he closed the laptop with a heavy, definitive snap. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound sympathy and absolute horror. "Harrison," he began, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "what I am about to tell you is going to destroy everything you thought you knew about your son. You need to brace yourself." I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. "Tell me," I demanded. Garrett leaned forward, clasping his scarred hands together. "Caldwell Property Management is not a real estate firm, Harrison. It is a completely hollow shell corporation. It is a sophisticated, highly organized criminal front. Derek and your daughter-in-law are running one of the most aggressive, devastating elder guardianship fraud syndicates I have ever seen in my entire career." I stared at him, the words ringing in my ears. "Guardianship fraud?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Garrett nodded grimly. "They are systematically targeting wealthy, socially isolated senior citizens, people who have massive paid-off estates but absolutely no family members nearby to check on them. They use corrupt private investigators to identify these vulnerable targets. Then they send in Dr. Eris. He is not a legitimate medical professional. He is a disgraced physician who lost his hospital privileges years ago. Derek pays him massive bribes to conduct fraudulent emergency medical evaluations. Eris writes up official reports falsely claiming that these perfectly healthy seniors are suffering from sudden, severe, and highly aggressive dementia. He declares them a direct, immediate danger to themselves and entirely mentally unfit to manage their own lives. The horrifying puzzle pieces began snapping together with sickening clarity. "Once they have that fake medical declaration," Garrett continued, his voice tight with anger, "Derek takes those documents straight to a corrupt county judge who is secretly on their payroll. This judge bypasses all standard legal waiting periods and immediately grants Derek absolute, unquestionable legal guardianship over the victim. In the eyes of the law, your son instantly becomes their complete master. He takes their cell phones. He cuts off their mail. He isolates them completely from the outside world. And then he begins the liquidation process. He legally sells their beautiful paid-off houses to his own shell corporations for pennies on the dollar. He empties their retirement accounts. He cashes out their life insurance policies. He steals every single thing they have worked their entire lives to build." My stomach violently churned. I thought of Sylvia Bennett, her frail body trembling in that sterile hospital bed, begging me to run away. "What happens to the people, Garrett?" I asked, dreading the answer. "What happens to them after Derek takes their money?" Garrett looked down at his hands. "Once the assets are entirely drained, the victims become a liability," he said softly. "Derek uses his absolute legal authority to forcefully commit them to terrible, underfunded, closed-door psychiatric wards. Facilities that ask absolutely zero questions as long as the monthly checks clear. He locks these terrified, perfectly sane people inside locked chemical wards. He strips them of their identity, heavily medicates them to keep them docile and confused, and simply leaves them there to rot away and die quietly in the dark. Sylvia Bennett is just the latest victim on a very long list. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it all crushed the breath completely out of my lungs. My son was not just a thief. He was a monster who stole human lives. He destroyed decades of hard work and locked innocent people away in chemical prisons just to fund his lavish, sickening lifestyle. The fake accident, the hospital stay, it was all a calculated maneuver to establish a perfect, unassailable alibi while they processed the largest batch of victims yet. And now they had their sights set on my house. They had changed my locks. They had stolen my original deed. They were actively preparing to declare me incompetent and throw me into the exact same dark, terrifying hole. I looked at Garrett, the cold, hard realization settling permanently into my bones. The time for grief was entirely over. I stood up from the diner booth, my jaw set like stone. "I am going to tear his entire operation down to the studs," I said, Garrett did not offer a pitying smile or a gentle word of caution. He simply reached across the laminated diner table, closed his heavy encrypted laptop, and nodded his head with the grim determination of a veteran detective who had just found his next target. He told me to go back to the motel, get whatever sleep I could physically manage, and meet him in the parking lot at dawn. We were going to shadow Monica. If Derek was the architect of this monstrous syndicate, Monica was the active boots-on-the-ground site manager. With Derek supposedly lying in a medically induced coma, she would be the one forced to handle the daily operations of their illicit empire. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, dull gray. I climbed into the passenger seat of Garrett's unmarked dark blue sedan. The vehicle smelled faintly of stale coffee and old leather, reminding me heavily of my early days driving to construction sites. Garrett handed me a pair of dark binoculars and put the car into drive. We parked a discreet distance down the street from my own house, watching my front door. At exactly 8 in the morning, Monica emerged. She looked immaculate, dressed in a sharp navy blue business suit, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. She did not look like a woman rushing to the intensive care unit to sit by her dying husband. She climbed into her black luxury SUV and pulled out of the driveway. We followed her, keeping 2 cars between us in the heavy morning traffic. Our first destination was not the hospital. Instead, Monica drove directly into the dense commercial heart of the city's financial district. We watched from a safe distance as she confidently strutted into a small, unbranded storefront, tucked between a dry cleaner and a vacant bakery. Garrett ran the address through his secure database. It was a notary public office, specifically one with a heavily suspended state license due to previous allegations of fraudulent document certification. She spent 45 minutes inside. When she emerged, she was sliding a thick stack of freshly stamped, sealed manila folders into her designer leather tote bag. The pit in my stomach tightened. I knew exactly what those folders contained. They were freshly forged property deeds and power of attorney transfers, newly stamped and ready to be filed with the corrupt county judges Garrett had mentioned. From the shady notary, we tailed her to an upscale, discreet branch of an international offshore banking institution. This was not a regular retail bank where you deposit a weekly paycheck. This was a fortress of financial secrecy, a place designed exclusively for moving massive, untraceable sums of money across global borders. She bypassed the standard teller lines and was immediately escorted into a private back office by a sharply dressed manager. She remained inside for over an hour. Garrett tapped his fingers rhythmically against the steering wheel, his eyes narrowed in intense concentration. "They are actively liquidating the stolen estates," he murmured quietly, never taking his eyes off the glass doors. "She is routing the stolen funds through layers of international shell companies to ensure the money can never be traced back to Caldwell Property Management. They are washing the blood completely clean off the cash." By early afternoon, Monica had completed a sprawling, deeply disturbing tour of the city's criminal underbelly. She visited 2 more shell company registration offices, a highly suspect private legal firm, and a luxury real estate brokerage known for flipping distressed properties for cash. Not once did she even drive near the hospital. Not once did she check on Derek. The entire medical emergency was a perfectly orchestrated illusion, a highly effective smokescreen designed to keep inquisitive relatives and nosy neighbors entirely at bay while she and Derek gutted the lives of innocent senior citizens. Her cold mechanical efficiency was absolutely terrifying. She was systematically processing human lives like they were nothing more than inventory on a warehouse loading dock. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the tall skyscrapers, Monica finally pulled her black SUV into the narrow, cracked alleyway behind a high-end private medical clinic. Garrett instantly killed the engine of our sedan and let the car roll silently to a halt near a rusted chain-link fence. We had a clear, unobstructed line of sight straight down the alley. Monica stepped out of her vehicle, her high heels clicking sharply against the dirty asphalt. She checked her expensive wristwatch and leaned against the brick wall, waiting. A few moments later, the heavy steel back door of the medical clinic creaked open. A man stepped out into the dim alleyway. He was tall, remarkably thin, and wore a pristine white physician's coat over a gray dress shirt. Garrett immediately reached into the back seat and pulled out a heavy professional-grade camera equipped with a massive telephoto lens. He rested the heavy lens against the edge of the slightly lowered window, adjusting the manual focus ring with practiced, steady precision. "That is him," Garrett whispered, the rapid mechanical clicking of the camera shutter filling the quiet car. "That is Dr. Aris, the man who signs the fraudulent dementia evaluations, the man who legally declares perfectly healthy senior citizens entirely incompetent." I raised my binoculars, my hands gripping the black plastic casing so tightly my joints ached. I watched as Monica offered the disgraced doctor a warm, familiar smile. She reached into her large designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Even from this distance, I could see the distinct, undeniable green edges of bundled $100 bills bulging against the paper seam. Monica handed the thick envelope directly to Dr. Aris. He took it greedily, sliding his thumb under the flap to quickly verify the massive stack of cash. He offered her a quick, satisfied nod, slipping the heavy envelope into the deep pocket of his white medical coat. In return, he handed Monica a thin blue medical folder. She opened it briefly, inspecting the signature at the bottom of the page, and smiled perfectly. It was a flawless, seamless transaction of pure evil. They were actively trading massive stacks of stolen cash for the legal authority to entirely erase a human being from society. The camera shutter continued to click rapidly, capturing every single damning second of the illicit exchange. Garrett had the indisputable hard photographic evidence we needed. I lowered my binoculars, leaning my heavy head back against the car seat. The chilling, horrifying reality of their entire operation finally crashed down upon me. I finally understood the terrifying depth of my son's depravity. They were executing a perfect, legally sanctioned erasure of living humans. And then a cold, paralyzing realization seized my chest. The digital lock on my front door, the empty safe, the sudden desperate push for me to take a secluded fishing trip. They were not just protecting their criminal enterprise from a nosy father. They had changed the locks and stolen my documents because my own son was preparing to declare me mentally incompetent. I was their next highly profitable victim, and they would pay for it. "I am going to tear his entire operation down to the studs," I said. Garrett nodded slowly, a hard glint reflecting in his dark eyes. He simply reached into his thick leather jacket and pulled out a heavy set of keys. "If we are going to war, Harrison, we need ammunition," he stated flatly. "In a court of law, a few long-distance photographs of a shady transaction in a dirty alleyway will not be enough to secure a conviction. They will claim it was a legitimate consultation fee. We need undeniable, crystal-clear audio and video evidence of them explicitly discussing their criminal enterprise, their intent to commit fraud, and their specific plans for you. We need to bug your house." We left the diner and drove to a nondescript electronics supply store located on the edge of the industrial district. Garrett used cash to purchase a highly sophisticated surveillance kit containing 4 micro cameras and a handful of audio transmitters. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the suburban streets into deep shadows, we drove back toward my neighborhood. We parked Garrett's unmarked sedan 3 blocks away, hiding it behind a thick row of evergreen hedges. We walked the rest of the distance in absolute silence, sticking to the dark patches between the streetlights. The night air was crisp, biting at my lungs, but my mind was focused on the monumental task ahead. I was prepared to cross any line to expose the profound evil thriving inside my family. We slipped through the side gate of my property, moving cautiously across the damp grass. The modern smart lock on my front door gleamed faintly in the dark, a silent taunt from the daughter-in-law who thought she had successfully locked me out of my own life. But Monica and Derek had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man they were actively trying to ruin. When you build a house with your own 2 hands, pouring the concrete foundation and meticulously framing the wooden walls, you know every hidden artery, every hidden vein of the structure. You intimately know the architectural secrets that no digital keypad can ever secure. I led Garrett to the rear of the house, stopping directly in front of the massive heating unit, nestled tightly against the brick foundation. I knelt in the damp soil, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my 70-year-old knees. I reached behind the heavy metal unit, running my calloused fingers along the cold brickwork until I found the hidden latch. 40 years ago, I had intentionally designed a secondary air return vent as a highly accessible maintenance crawlspace, a practical shortcut to access the basement plumbing without tearing up the hardwood floors upstairs. I twisted the hidden latch and pulled the heavy iron grate completely free, setting it softly on the grass. The narrow tunnel stretched out before us, disappearing into the pitch-black belly of the house. I took a deep breath, grabbed the canvas bag of surveillance equipment from Garrett, and crawled headfirst into the oppressive darkness beneath my home. The space was incredibly tight, smelling strongly of old dust and dry earth. I dragged my heavy body forward on my elbows and knees, the rough concrete scraping painfully against my work jacket. At my advanced age, the physical exertion was undeniably intense. Every muscle in my back screamed in protest, but the burning righteous anger fueling my heart pushed me relentlessly forward. Garrett followed closely behind me, his heavy breathing echoing loudly in the confined space. We navigated the narrow tunnel for 20 feet, until we finally reached the secondary access hatch that opened directly into my basement study. I pushed the wooden panel upward, creating a gap just large enough for us to squeeze through the opening and successfully infiltrate the fortified structure that my treacherous son thought he had entirely secured. I hoisted myself up and tumbled onto the familiar Persian rug of my study, gasping quietly for clean air. Garrett emerged a second later, quickly wiping the thick layer of dust from his dark jacket. We did not waste a single second. The house was completely silent, heavy with the suffocating emptiness of a stolen home. Garrett unzipped the canvas bag and began distributing the highly advanced surveillance devices. He was a seasoned professional, moving with incredible methodical efficiency. We started right there in the basement study, securing a pinhole camera behind the thick bindings of an encyclopedia set on the top bookshelf. This position gave us a perfect sweeping view of the heavy oak desk and the empty floor safe where Derek had brazenly stolen the physical foundation of my entire life's work. We crept silently up the wooden staircase, the familiar creak of the third step sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. We moved into the expansive living room, bathed only in the pale moonlight spilling through the tall glass windows. Garrett attached a microscopic audio transmitter to the underside of the heavy mahogany coffee table directly in the center of the seating area where Derek and Monica would likely sit to discuss their horrific plans. I took a second micro camera and carefully wedged it deep inside the intricate carved wooden molding of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner, adjusting the tiny lens to cover the entire dining room and the main hallway. The bitter irony of bugging my own sanctuary, turning the peaceful home I had built for Martha into a digital trap for our son, was a jagged pill. We worked with urgent precision, double-checking the hidden placements and verifying the wireless signal feeds on Garrett's encrypted mobile device. Everything was completely operational. We had successfully wired the entire ground floor without leaving a single trace of our secret intrusion. I nodded to Garrett, signaling that it was finally time to retreat. We moved silently back toward the basement door, eager to return to the safety of the dark crawlspace and vanish into the freezing night. But just as my hand touched the brass knob of the basement door, a sharp electronic chirp violently shattered the silence of the house. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of the digital smart lock being engaged from the outside porch. My blood turned to freezing ice. A heavy clack echoed through the hallway as the deadbolt retracted. The front door swung open, the hinges groaning softly in the night. Heavy footsteps stepped onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. The bright overhead lights of the entryway flickered on, casting sharp shadows across the floorboards. I grabbed Garrett by the shoulder, shoving him roughly backward into the dark stairwell, pulling the basement door shut until only a microscopic gap remained. We were instantly plunged into absolute darkness, standing frozen on the top step, completely trapped in the terrifying shadows of my own basement. I held my breath, my chest burning in sheer panic, listening as two familiar voices began echoing loudly down the corridor, moving dangerously close to our hidden position. I had successfully broken into my very own home, but now my predators had unexpectedly arrived to seal the devastating trap. I held my breath in the dark stairwell, pressing against the cold wall. Garrett stood rigid, his cane hovering above the wooden steps to prevent any sound. Through the microscopic gap in the doorframe, a sliver of light sliced into our hiding place. The footsteps moved from the foyer onto the hardwood floors of the hallway. The clicking of Monica's heels was unmistakable, but the second set of footsteps sent a cold shockwave through my nervous system. They were heavy, confident, and entirely familiar. I shifted my weight, leaning closer to the narrow crack. From this angle, I had an unobstructed view directly into my living room. Monica walked into the frame first, carelessly tossing her purse onto the plush sofa. She let out a dramatic sigh of relief, reaching up to massage her neck. A moment later, a tall figure stepped into the warm glow of the living room lights. My heart violently seized in my chest, forgetting how to beat. It was Derek. My son was standing right there in the middle of the room. There was no hospital gown. There were no bandages, no monitors, and no signs of a horrific car crash. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his tie loosened casually around his neck. In his right hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with expensive scotch. I pressed my hands against my mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to tear out of my throat. My mind struggled to process the impossible image standing right in front of me. Just a few hours ago, I had stood beside a hospital bed, agonizing over losing my child. Now that same child was casually sipping liquor in my living room. Derek took a slow sip and collapsed comfortably into my leather recliner. He let out a deep laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. "I cannot believe how perfectly that went," he said. "That old fool actually swallowed the fishing trip story, hook, line, and sinker. He is probably halfway to Lake George by now, crying over the steering wheel and praying for my miraculous recovery." Monica perched on this arm of the recliner, running her fingers through his hair. "You have to admit, it was a brilliant pivot," she said, a wicked smirk playing on her lips. "When he showed up at the hospital demanding answers about the Bennett estate, I really thought we were exposed. He is incredibly stubborn when he gets a suspicious idea in his head." Derek scoffed, taking another long drink. "My dad is a dinosaur, Monica. He thinks property management is about fixing leaky pipes and painting fences. He has absolutely no concept of how the real world operates today. He is just a gullible old contractor who builds boxes for people to live in." He was too distracted by the blinking hospital monitors to realize he was standing inside the ultimate command center. I stood frozen in the dark stairwell, listening to my own flesh and blood casually dissect my grief. Derek had never been in a crash. He had not suffered a traumatic brain injury. The intensive care unit quarantine was a meticulously crafted theater piece. By checking into the restricted ward under the supervision of the corrupt Dr. Aris, Derek had achieved two critical objectives. First, he created an impenetrable alibi that kept his naive, grieving father completely distracted and paralyzed by fear. Second, he gained unchallenged access to the hospital's internal patient database. Derek continued talking, confirming my terrifying suspicions with every arrogant word that left his mouth. "Aris is worth every single penny we pay him," Derek said, swirling the ice in his glass. "Getting me that private corner suite on the 4th floor was the smartest strategic move we have ever made. I spent the last 3 days tapping directly into the hospital intake registry. Do you have any idea how many wealthy, isolated senior citizens check into that hospital with 0 emergency contacts listed on their admission forms? It is an absolute goldmine. They are just sitting there in those beds entirely alone, completely frightened and absolutely ripe for the taking." Monica smiled, reaching over to pick up a thick manila folder from the coffee table. It was the same folder she had received from the disgraced doctor. "And now we have 5 brand new medical declarations of severe dementia." She noted her voice trembling with dark excitement. 5 new targets entirely legally neutralized. As soon as the judge stamps these power of attorney transfers tomorrow morning, we can begin the liquidation process on their estates. We will have their houses on the market and their bank accounts drained by the end of the month." Derek laughed again, a harsh sound that made my stomach violently churn. "The hospital staff is completely clueless," he bragged. "Those gullible nurses practically handed me their patient files. They were so busy feeling sorry for the poor businessman in a coma that they did not even question why Eris was ordering psychiatric transfers for half the elderly ward. We just package them up, take their money, and dump them in the asylum where nobody will ever bother to look for them again." Standing in the suffocating shadows of the basement stairwell, I felt my heart break. The profound grief of realizing my son was a monster threatened to bring me to my knees. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders through the county fair. I had spent my entire life breaking my back on construction sites just to ensure he had a better future. And he had taken that future and used it to become a ruthless predator. But as the agonizing wave of paternal grief washed over me, something else rose up to take its place. It was a burning, intensely protective rage. It was the fury of a man who had spent his life building strong foundations, now watching someone try to burn the entire neighborhood down. My sadness was completely incinerated by the absolute need for justice. I slowly reached out in the dark, my fingers finding the reassuring edge of Garrett's heavy tablet. I tapped his shoulder twice in the darkness. Garrett understood immediately. He smoothly lifted the digital receiver, the screen glowing with a faint light. The tiny microphones we had planted underneath the mahogany coffee table were picking up every single word with crystal-clear precision. The micro cameras hidden inside the antique grandfather clock were recording Derek sitting in the chair perfectly healthy, holding his scotch, and openly bragging about his massive criminal syndicate. I watched the digital audio bars spike and fall on Garrett's screen, capturing the final damning pieces of evidence we desperately needed. I reached out, placing my thumb directly over the recording button, and pressed down firmly. The trap they thought they had set for me had just violently snapped shut, directly on their own necks. I was no longer a grieving father mourning a tragic accident. I was the architect of their impending destruction. The war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure they lost absolutely everything. I pressed my ear closer to the narrow crack in the basement door, scarcely daring to draw a breath into my burning lungs. Beside me in the pitch-black stairwell, Garrett held the digital receiver steady. The faint green glow from the screen illuminated the deep lines etched into his weathered face. Through the microscopic earpiece we shared, the audio feed from the living room was terrifyingly crisp. The clinking of ice against crystal echoed through the digital transmission, followed by the heavy, unmistakable thud of a leather briefcase being dropped onto the solid mahogany coffee table. It was the exact same briefcase I had pried open in the hospital room just hours earlier. I watched through the sliver of light as Derek unfastened the brass latches with a sharp snap. He casually tossed a stack of thick manila folders onto the table, treating the stolen lives of innocent people like discarded junk mail. Monica leaned forward, picking up a pen and a leather-bound ledger. "Let us review the current inventory," she said, her voice entirely devoid of human empathy. "We need to expedite the Bennett liquidation before the end of the fiscal quarter." Derek took a long, arrogant sip of his expensive scotch. "The paperwork for Sylvia is completely finalized and secured," he stated smoothly. "Aris filed the medical incompetence declaration this morning, and the corrupt judge stamped the absolute guardianship order before noon. I already authorized the rapid sale of her primary residence to our offshore shell corporation for roughly 10% of its actual market value. The funds from her private savings accounts have already been successfully wired through the international routing system. She is legally penniless, and the psychiatric ward has heavily sedated her. She will not be causing us any more annoying problems today." The sheer clinical detachment in my son's voice made the blood freeze solid within my veins. They were casually discussing the total destruction of an 82-year-old woman as if they were reviewing quarterly profit margins. I felt a rough, calloused hand grip my shoulder tightly in the absolute darkness. Garrett was looking at me, his dark eyes communicating a silent, steadfast support. We had the undeniable audio confession we needed to put them both behind bars for decades, but the horrors were far from over. I watched through the narrow gap in the doorframe as Derek reached back into the dark leather briefcase. He pulled out a remarkably thick, heavily tabulated file and tossed it onto the center of the coffee table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sent a sudden, inexplicable shiver running directly down my spine. "We need to pivot our immediate attention to the crown jewel of this entire operation," Derek said, tapping his index finger against the cover of the file. "I have been laying the meticulous groundwork for this specific acquisition for over 2 years, and the timing is finally perfect." Monica leaned closer to the table, adjusting her posture. She trailed her manicured fingernail over the printed label on the tab. I strained my eyes against the harsh glare of the living room lights, desperately trying to read the black ink from my hidden vantage point. I did not need to see the letters to know the truth. Harrison Caldwell. Monica read aloud, her voice dripping with a predatory, sickeningly sweet anticipation. "The house is completely clear of any outstanding mortgages, and the surrounding land value has skyrocketed over the past decade. It is a massive, incredibly lucrative target. How do we proceed with the final extraction phase?" Derek leaned back in my favorite leather recliner, crossing his legs with the casual confidence of a victor who believed the battle was already entirely won. "Phase 1 of the total extraction is already successfully complete," he bragged, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "When the old fool rushed to the hospital last night, crying over my fake injuries, he left the house completely vulnerable. I slipped out of the private suite, drove over here, and bypassed his pathetic floor safe in the basement study. It was almost too easy. I forged his signature on the bearer bonds and initiated a complete, irreversible liquidation of his entire retirement portfolio. The funds have already been washed and securely deposited into our primary offshore account. He is entirely stripped of his liquid capital." I felt my lungs constrict, fighting the violent urge to kick the heavy wooden door open and wrap my hands around his throat. He had not just stolen all of my hard-earned money. He had systematically dismantled the financial security I had spent 40 grueling years building for my family. Monica let out a soft, delighted laugh, raising her glass in a mock toast. "That is brilliant execution, darling," she praised him. "Stripping his liquid resources is the perfect tactical maneuver. Without immediate access to his massive savings, he will be completely incapable of hiring a competent defense attorney when we initiate the final legal trap. He is already financially isolated." "But what about the property deed?" she asked, leaning forward with greedy curiosity. "You cannot just forge a transfer document for a multi-million-dollar estate without raising massive red flags at the county registry office. How do we officially and legally steal the actual house without immediately triggering a massive, incredibly tedious federal criminal investigation?" Derek smiled, a chilling, hollow expression that resembled a starving wolf cornering a wounded animal. "We use the exact same strategy we used on Sylvia Bennett," he explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, malicious whisper. "Transferring a high-value physical property requires the current owner to be declared permanently, legally incompetent. The empty safe was just the necessary first step to ensure he could not legally fight back. Phase 2 begins on Monday morning. I have already scheduled Dr. Aris to conduct a mandatory in-home trauma counseling session for the grieving father. Aris will officially document that the severe, overwhelming emotional stress of my tragic accident has triggered a rapid, irreversible cognitive decline. He will declare the old man completely delusional, deeply paranoid, and a severe danger to himself. Once that fraudulent medical document is signed, our judge will grant me absolute, unchallenged power of attorney over his entire life." Derek took a final long sip of his scotch, placing the empty glass heavily on the table. "The old man is completely useless now," he scoffed, his words dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. All he knows how to do is hammer nails and pour dirty concrete. He is a pathetic, outdated relic who belongs in a locked ward. He will not see this coming until the orderly is strapping him into a straitjacket. I stood in the dark stairwell, the audio receiver picking up the sound of their cruel shared laughter. My own son had just outlined a flawless, devastating blueprint to legally erase my existence and throw me into a chemical prison. I closed my eyes, letting the profound, shattering betrayal wash completely over me. When I opened them again, the grieving father was gone. Only the contractor remained, and I was going to tear it apart. I stayed perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of the basement stairwell, my heart hammering a slow, rhythmic beat against my ribs. Beside me, Garrett held the digital receiver, the faint green glow casting deep shadows across his face as the audio levels spiked and dipped. In the living room above us, the clinking of crystal glasses against the mahogany coffee table signaled a shift in their conversation. Derek let out a long, contented sigh, the sound vibrating through the microscopic transmitter we had hidden just inches from his polished shoes. He tapped his fingers against the armrest of my favorite leather recliner, the rhythmic thud echoing loudly in our earpieces. We have the motive, we have the forged documents, and we have the offshore accounts, completely prepped, Derek said, his tone shifting from boastful arrogance to calculated precision. Now we need to discuss the exact execution timeline. The old man is scheduled to return from his pathetic little fishing trip on Friday afternoon. We cannot afford any delays. Every day he spends walking around as a free man is a massive liability to the entire operation. If he checks his retirement portfolio before we finalize the medical hold, he will immediately call the federal authorities, and this entire beautiful empire will burn to the ground. We need to neutralize him the absolute second he steps foot through the front door. Monica hummed in agreement, the sound of her shifting her weight on the plush sofa filtering through the feed. "I have already anticipated the schedule, darling," she murmured smoothly. "I left him a very convincing, tearful voicemail about an hour ago. I told him that your miraculous recovery has progressed so rapidly that the doctors are releasing you from the hospital tomorrow morning. I begged him to cut his lake trip short and come straight home on Friday evening for a quiet, intimate family celebration, a welcome home dinner to celebrate your second chance at life. He is so hopelessly devoted to you that he will undoubtedly drive straight through the night just to be here." Derek chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "A welcome home dinner," he repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth like a fine wine. "That is wonderfully poetic. What is on the menu for the condemned man?" Monica's voice dropped an octave laced with a terrifying clinical detachment. "I picked up the special prescription from Dr. Arazzi during our meeting in the alley today," she explained casually. "It is a highly potent, unprescribed psychotropic sedative. Eris assured me it is completely odorless, tasteless, and dissolves instantly in alcohol. I plan to pour him a generous glass of his favorite vintage red wine the moment he walks through the door. I will spike the wine with a massive concentrated dose of the sedative. According to Eris, the chemical cocktail is specifically designed to induce acute, terrifying hallucinations, severe paranoia, and violent physical delirium within 20 minutes of ingestion. By the time we serve the appetizers, your sweet, loving father will not even know his own name. He will be completely disconnected from reality, thrashing around the dining room like a rabid animal." I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my spine hard against the cold concrete wall of the stairwell. My own daughter-in-law was casually detailing a precise, merciless plan to chemically poison me in my own dining room. I could vividly picture the sickening scene they were meticulously constructing for my arrival. I would walk through my front door exhausted and overwhelmed with sheer, unadulterated joy at seeing my son perfectly alive, only to be handed a poisoned chalice by the treacherous woman I had welcomed into my family. They were intentionally going to weaponize my purest fatherly love purposefully, using my overwhelming emotional relief to lower my protective defenses completely. Garrett shot me a side glance, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding in the absolute dark. He did not say a single word, but the burning, ferocious intensity in his eyes mirrored the raging inferno currently consuming my soul. Derek's voice broke through the earpiece again, dripping with sadistic anticipation. And once the heavy drugs take full effect, I execute the checkmate maneuver, he stated proudly. The moment he becomes delirious and combative, I will immediately dial the emergency services. I will play the terrified, heartbroken son to absolute perfection. I will tell the police dispatchers that my elderly father is suffering from a violent, sudden onset dementia episode, that he is completely out of control, and that my wife and I genuinely fear for our physical safety. When the uniformed officers arrive, they will find a raving, aggressive old man completely destroying the living room. They will not ask questions. They will simply restrain him for his own good. Dr. Aris is already on high alert, completely on standby for Friday night. As soon as the police secure him, Aris will officially sign the mandatory 72-hour emergency psychiatric hold. They will strap the old fool to a gurney, sedate him even further, and lock him deep inside the secure ward of the state asylum. Monica clapped her hands together softly, the sound sharp and piercing through the audio feed. It is an absolutely flawless strategy, she praised him. Once he is chemically restrained and locked behind secure steel doors, the corrupt judge will automatically grant you full, unquestionable legal guardianship by Monday morning. You will have absolute control over his physical body, his medical decisions, and his multi-million-dollar estate. We can list this beautiful property on the real estate market. By next Wednesday, transfer the entire sale proceeds into our primary offshore limited liability company and walk away with an absolute fortune. Harrison Caldwell will effectively cease to exist as a free, autonomous citizen by Friday midnight. His entire life will be completely legally over, and there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop us. I listened to them clink their crystal glasses together in the brightly lit living room, actively celebrating their brilliant, absolutely flawless master plan to completely steal my life. They were toasting to my impending destruction, entirely convinced that they held all the winning cards, but they had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They believed I was a frail, ignorant old man blindly walking into their trap. They had absolutely no idea that I was standing in the shadows directly beneath their feet, listening to every single arrogant, treacherous word they spoke. I felt Garrett tap my shoulder, signaling that it was finally safe to move. The audio feed confirmed that Derek and Monica were heading upstairs to the master bedroom to celebrate their victory. I turned around in the suffocating darkness of the stairwell, my movements silent and incredibly deliberate. I crawled back through the narrow, dusty vents of the HVAC system alongside Garrett, my mind completely consumed by a cold, hardened clarity. The initial paralyzing shock and the profound, agonizing grief were entirely gone. Friday night was rapidly approaching, and I was going to serve them a devastating feast of my very own. We retreated to the damp safety of the Starlight Motor Inn, the gravity of the audio recordings weighing heavily upon us. Sitting at the tiny scratched laminate table, Garrett played the terrifying audio file back for a third time. The chilling clarity of my son, casually plotting to erase my existence, filled the cramped room. My initial instinct, fueled by pure, unadulterated fatherly rage, was to march directly into the local police precinct and throw the recording onto the captain's desk. But Garrett quickly extinguished that fire with a heavy dose of hardened detective logic. We could not simply go to the authorities yet. Derek had meticulously built a fortress of legally flawless documentation. His forged power of attorney, the heavily padded medical evaluations, and the corrupt county judge completely shielded his operation from surface-level scrutiny. If we went to the police right now, Derek would simply claim I was already exhibiting severe paranoia and violently acting out my dementia. He would initiate the 72-hour psychiatric hold immediately, and the corrupt judge would rubber stamp the order before a single detective even opened a preliminary investigation file. The audio recording was powerful, but Derek's high-priced legal team would easily argue it was illegally obtained and strictly inadmissible in a court of law. We needed a silver bullet. We needed living, breathing proof that bypassed the forged paperwork entirely. We needed a victim who could testify to the precise mechanics of the fraud. We needed Sylvia Bennett. Garrett spent the next 5 hours relentlessly pounding his keyboard, utilizing every back-channel contact he had left in the state registry. Just before dawn, he finally broke through the encryption. Derek had forcefully transferred Sylvia to the Oak Ridge Behavioral Center, a highly secretive, privately funded psychiatric facility located deep in the rural wooded outskirts of the county. It was a notoriously tight, black site famous for heavy sedation, absolute silence, and accepting massive unquestioned checks from aggressive legal guardians. Breaking her out through the front door was physically and legally impossible. The facility was surrounded by 12-foot steel fences, and every single entry point was secured by heavy magnetic locks that required authorized keycards. But Monica and Derek had forgotten one crucial detail. I was a seasoned commercial contractor who had spent 40 years building and wiring industrial facilities exactly like Oak Ridge. I did not need a keycard to open a magnetic lock. I pulled up the municipal zoning blueprints on Garrett's laptop and studied the structural electrical grid. The facility was heavily fortified, but it relied entirely on a massive external high-voltage transformer located just outside the eastern perimeter fence. The backup generators were programmed to supply emergency power to the life support systems and emergency lighting, but there was a hardwired 10-minute sequential delay before the heavy magnetic security doors would fully reboot and re-engage. If I could violently short out that main transformer, Garrett would have a 10-minute window of absolute darkness to breach the ward. We waited until 3 in the morning the following night. The air was bitterly cold, hanging thick with dense rural fog. I parked my heavy work truck a half-mile down a dirt access road, leaving the engine idling in the shadows. Garrett slipped out of the passenger side, pulling his dark collar high up around his neck, and limped silently into the tree line, heading straight for the facility's rear emergency exit door. I grabbed my heavy canvas tool bag, a pair of thick rubber-insulated lineman gloves, and a massive set of industrial bolt cutters. I hiked swiftly through the damp brush until the towering steel frame of the Oak Ridge electrical transformer loomed out of the fog. It hummed with a deep, vibrating energy. I checked my watch, watching the second hand tick down precisely to our synchronized infiltration time. When the dial hit the absolute mark, I pulled the heavy rubber gloves onto my hands. I gripped the massive bolt cutters, swung them upward, and clamped the hardened steel jaws directly across the main exposed high-voltage conductive cables connecting the grid to the facility. I squeezed the heavy handles together with every ounce of physical strength my 70-year-old body could muster. The resulting explosion was violently spectacular. A massive, blinding shower of blue sparks erupted into the foggy night, followed immediately by a deafening crack that shook the cold ground beneath my boots. The humming transformer died instantly. Across the field, the entire psychiatric facility plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy magnetic locks on the exterior doors audibly disengaged with a series of loud mechanical thuds. The countdown had officially begun. I threw the bolt cutters into the brush and crouched low in the shadows, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Inside the pitch-black facility, Garrett pushed open the heavy rear exit door and slipped silently into the chaotic, darkened corridors. The emergency backup lights cast an eerie, sickly yellow glow over the linoleum floors. Garrett navigated the maze of locked wards with the practiced, invisible stealth of a 30-year undercover detective. He bypassed the panicked, confused night nurses who were frantically trying to reset the electrical panels, moving directly toward the high-security isolation wing, where Sylvia had been violently discarded. He found room 412, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped inside. Sylvia Bennett was lying in the small, sterile bed, looking incredibly frail and heavily medicated in the pale emergency light. But when Garrett softly whispered her name and mentioned my visit to the intensive care unit, a sharp, undeniable spark of lucid clarity flashed directly through her terrified eyes. Garrett quickly explained that he could not physically remove her from the facility without instantly triggering a massive state manhunt that would ruin our entire operation. He needed hard, undeniable proof to bring the entire criminal syndicate crashing down. Sylvia did not hesitate. Her hands trembled violently as she reached deep underneath the thin mattress and pulled out a small, tightly rolled bundle of paper. It was a secret, meticulously handwritten ledger. Even through the heavy sedation, the brilliant woman had managed to secretly record every single asset Derek had forcefully demanded she sign, over detailing the exact dates, the specific shell companies, and the horrific threats Dr. Aris had used to coerce her. It was the ultimate, indisputable smoking gun. But Garrett needed one more piece of ammunition. He pulled out his encrypted smartphone, switched the camera to record, and held it up in the dim light. Sylvia looked directly into the digital lens. Her voice was weak, raspy from severe dehydration, but it carried the devastating weight of absolute truth. She detailed the horrific abuse, the medical torture, and the systematic theft of her entire life's work by Derek. She named the corrupt doctor, the fake notary, and the offshore accounts. As the 10-minute window rapidly closed and the heavy magnetic locks began to sequentially reboot down the hallway, Sylvia grabbed Garrett by the wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You give this to Harrison," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Burn them to the ground." We made it out of the woods and back to the truck just as the massive transformer groaned to life. The psychiatric facility lit up behind us, but we were already merging onto the desolate highway armed with the undeniable truth. Sylvia Bennett had handed us the ultimate weapon. Now we needed someone who knew exactly how to fire it. As dawn broke over the city, I drove straight to the private residence of Benjamin Wright. Benjamin was a fierce attorney who had handled my commercial construction contracts for decades and guided me through the legal complexities of Martha's estate. He was a man of unbending integrity. I pounded heavily on his front door. When he opened it, his tired eyes immediately registered the grim exhaustion etched into my face. He ushered Garrett and me into his warm, wood-paneled study without a single word of protest. I sat down in the heavy leather armchair and unloaded the entire horrific nightmare. And we played the crystal-clear audio recordings of Derek and Monica plotting my chemical imprisonment. We showed him the high-resolution telephoto images of Monica handing a thick envelope of cash to the disgraced Dr. Aris in the dirty clinic alleyway. Finally, Garrett placed his encrypted smartphone on the polished mahogany desk and played Sylvia's devastating video testimony, followed by the meticulously detailed handwritten ledger she had kept hidden beneath her asylum mattress. Benjamin watched the screen in absolute horrified silence. His hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. When the video ended, he took off his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbed his eyes with trembling fingers. "I have spent 40 years practicing law in this city," Harrison Benjamin whispered, his voice vibrating with a profound, unadulterated disgust. "I have seen corporate greed and familial betrayal, but I have never witnessed a coordinated, systematic evil quite like this. Your son is operating a completely merciless syndicate. They are stripping innocent human beings of their basic constitutional rights and selling their lives for profit. We are going to bury him under the absolute maximum weight of the federal justice system." Benjamin pulled out the forged property transfer documents that Derek had filed to initiate the theft of my estate. Garrett had pulled the digital copies from the corrupt notary's server. Benjamin spread the legal pages across his desk, running a silver fountain pen down the margins with practiced surgical precision. His eyes darted across the complex corporate jargon, searching for any structural weakness in Derek's seemingly flawless legal armor. Suddenly, Benjamin stopped. The silver pen hovered over a specific paragraph buried deep within the third page of the limited liability company transfer agreement. A slow, sharp smile spread across his weathered face. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with the brilliant light of a hunter finding the exact vulnerability in his prey. "Derek made a catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation," Benjamin stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "He created a highly specific, aggressively shielded offshore corporate entity to absorb your property. But in his rush to completely sever the paper trail, he utilized a state-specific legal framework that requires a highly stringent verification protocol. Transferring a multi-million-dollar primary residence into this specific type of blind trust cannot simply be done with a forged signature on a digital document. It strictly mandates a live physical signature executed in person and immediately certified by a sworn state witness. I frowned, the pieces slowly locking together in my exhausted mind. "That is why they need me at the house on Friday night," I said quietly. Benjamin nodded emphatically. "Exactly. The welcome home dinner is not just a convenient excuse to isolate you and drug your wine. They need you physically present in your dining room because they are bringing their corrupt notary directly to the house. They plan to slip you that severe psychotropic drug, wait until you are chemically confused, and physically guide your hand to sign the final deed transfer right in front of their paid witness. Once the ink is dry and the property is legally theirs, Derek will call the police, claim you are having a violent dementia episode, and hand you over to Dr. Aris for the mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold. It is a dual-purpose trap. They get the millions from the house and then they completely throw away the key to your life. The empty safe was merely phase one, a tactical strike to strip me of my liquid capital, so I could not afford a lawyer when the real trap closed. Derek truly believed that I was just a useless old contractor who only knew how to hammer nails. He thought I would blindly walk into the slaughterhouse completely oblivious to the blade. Derek drastically underestimated the man who taught him to build things. "We are not taking this to the local police precinct," Benjamin stated firmly, reaching for his desk phone. "Derek has already bought off too many county judges. If we file a standard criminal complaint, his syndicate will intercept the paperwork and legally suffocate us in procedural delays. We need a tactical strike force that operates entirely outside of Derek's corrupted municipal influence." Benjamin dialed a highly restricted direct line number he had cultivated over decades of practicing elite corporate law. I listened as he bypassed standard reception desks and was connected to a senior director at the Federal Bureau of Investigation within the elite white-collar crime division. Benjamin wasted no time with pleasantries. He methodically laid out the undeniable evidence we had gathered. He detailed the systemic elder guardianship fraud, the chemical imprisonment of Sylvia Bennett, the massive offshore money laundering network, and the attempt to steal my estate and chemically imprison me on Friday night. The federal agent on the other end of the line listened with grim intensity. When Benjamin mentioned the audio recordings, the high-resolution surveillance photographs, and Sylvia's physical ledger detailing the exact flow of the stolen millions, the agent's tone instantly shifted to absolute focused mobilization. Benjamin placed the phone on the speaker setting, allowing Garrett and me to hear the federal director's voice filling the study. "Mr. Caldwell," the agent said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of federal authority, "what your son orchestrated is a massive criminal conspiracy. We have been actively hunting the financial shadows of this specific operation for 6 months, but we lacked the undeniable link to the organizers. You have just handed us the entire syndicate on a silver platter. But to successfully capture every single co-conspirator, including the corrupt medical staff and the dirty notaries, we must catch them in the absolute act of executing the fraud. We need them to spring the trap exactly as they planned." I looked at the photograph of Martha sitting on Benjamin's bookshelf, drawing deep strength from her memory. "I am ready," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. "I will walk through that front door on Friday night." The trap was officially set. My son thought my life would end by Friday midnight, but it was his life that was about to end. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that clung to the suburban streets. I drove my dusty work truck slowly down my familiar block, pulling into my own driveway just as the sun began to set behind the manicured trees. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself for the absolute performance of my entire life. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed my faded canvas duffel bag, making sure to let my shoulders slump forward. I dragged my heavy boots across the pavement, projecting the perfect image of a thoroughly exhausted, sunburned old man returning home. Every step toward the front porch was a calculated, deliberate act of deception. I reached for the brass handle, silently noting the faint scratch marks where the new digital deadbolt had been installed. I pushed the door open, letting it creak slightly on its hinges, and stepped into the cool, air-conditioned foyer of my stolen sanctuary. "Hello," I called out, letting my voice waver just a fraction, injecting a false note of paternal anxiety into the quiet house. "I am home. Is anyone here?" The response was incredibly swift, practically rehearsed. A soft, sympathetic voice called out from the formal dining room, urging me to come inside. I dropped my heavy canvas bag onto the hardwood floor and shuffled slowly down the corridor, leaning heavily against the painted walls for imaginary support. When I turned the corner and stepped into the dining room, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of their deception nearly knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. Derek was sitting directly at the head of the long oak table, strapped securely into a bulky metal frame wheelchair. He was wearing a loose-fitting gray hospital gown over his clothes, his right arm resting delicately in a thick sling. A pristine, stark white bandage was wrapped tightly around his forehead. He looked up at me and offered a weak, incredibly convincing grimace of physical pain. "Dad," he rasped, his voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion. "I discharged early just to see you. The doctors said I needed absolute rest, but I could not stand the thought of you sitting in that cabin worrying yourself into an early grave over me. I wanted to be here to welcome you home. It took every ounce of disciplined restraint I had cultivated over a 40-year career to stop myself from reaching across the table and wrapping my hands around his treacherous throat. Just 48 hours ago, I had watched this exact same man standing in my living room, in a tailored charcoal suit, drinking expensive scotch and laughing about locking me inside a chemical prison. Now he was playing the miraculously recovered devoted son to absolute perfection. I forced hot tears into the corners of my eyes and rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside his bulky wheelchair. I carefully wrapped my arms around his shoulders, intentionally avoiding his fake injuries, and let out a dramatic sob. "Oh, my boy," I whispered, burying my face into his shoulder to hide my absolute disgust. I was so incredibly terrified. I prayed for you every single night on that lake. I thought I was going to lose you. Derek patted my back with his free hand, his touch sending a violent chill down my spine. "It is okay, Dad," he murmured softly. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." Monica stepped out of the kitchen carrying a steaming silver platter of roasted chicken and seasoned vegetables. She was wearing a flowing white dress, the absolute picture of an adoring wife. "Oh, Harrison," she cooed, setting the heavy platter down in the center of the table. "We are just so incredibly blessed that our family is finally back together. Please sit down. You look absolutely exhausted from your long drive. Let us take care of you tonight." I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, my joints popping loudly. I took my assigned seat on the right side of the table. The dining room was illuminated by a warm golden chandelier. Monica moved with a predatory grace. She glided over to the antique credenza and picked up a heavy bottle of red wine. I watched her hands closely. She pulled the cork with a soft pop and reached for a set of tall crystal wine glasses. She filled Derek's glass with a small splash, then moved gracefully over to my side of the long wooden table. She did not pour my drink from the main bottle. Instead, she picked up a specific pre-poured glass resting near the edge of the credenza. The deep ruby liquid sloshed gently against the crystal rim. She brought the glass over and placed it deliberately onto the linen placemat, directly in front of my plate. "Drink up, Dad," she said, her pale green eyes gleaming with a dark, deeply suppressed malice. "You look completely exhausted. This specific vintage will help you sleep incredibly well tonight." She rested her hand softly on my shoulder, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging slightly into the fabric of my flannel shirt. I stared down at the dark, poisoned chalice resting inches from my fingers. I knew exactly what was suspended inside that expensive red wine. I knew about the massive, unprescribed dose of the heavy psychotropic sedative that Dr. Aris had provided. I knew that within 20 short minutes, my mind would violently fracture into terrifying hallucinations and severe paranoia. I knew Derek was waiting with a phone in his pocket, entirely ready to dial the emergency dispatchers and report my sudden violent dementia episode. They were waiting for me to drink my own literal destruction. I slowly reached out, wrapping my trembling, calloused fingers around the delicate crystal stem of the wine glass. I could practically feel Derek and Monica completely holding their breath, their eyes locked intensely onto my hands. The entire room grew deathly quiet, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. I lifted the heavy glass off the linen placemat, bringing the rim agonizingly close to my lips. The dark red liquid shimmered under the golden chandelier light. Monica leaned in closer, a triumphant smile forming on her mouth. Derek gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, completely rigid with predatory anticipation. Right. As the cold crystal edge brushed against my bottom lip, I intentionally and violently twitched my entire right arm. I let my wrist collapse inward, my fingers suddenly splaying open in a perfectly executed spasm of feigned elderly weakness. The heavy crystal glass slipped through my grasp. It plummeted downward, striking the wooden edge of the dining table before crashing violently onto the solid hardwood floor below. The glass shattered into jagged shards, sending a massive wave of dark, poisoned red wine splashing aggressively across Monica's pristine white shoes. The crash echoed loudly through the silent house. "Oh, my silly old hands," I muttered, feigning embarrassment. I dropped to my knees, dabbing the stain. Monica inhaled sharply. Derek shot her a warning glance. "It is fine, Dad," Derek said. Monica grabbed a fresh goblet, fully intending to improvise a secondary dose right in front of me. Before her hand could even touch the bottle, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the suffocating tension. It was the loud chime of the front doorbell ringing. The sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through the dining room, freezing Monica instantly in her tracks. Her hand hovered in the air, inches away from the fresh wine glass. Derek let out a sharp laugh that broke the heavy silence. His eyes lit up with a greedy, victorious gleam. He looked across the table at me, his expression softening back into that sickening mask of a loving son. "That must be my surprise guest, Dad," he said smoothly. "I invited a close friend over to officially witness us celebrating our new chapter together. Let me go get the door." I watched completely motionless as the greatest medical miracle of the modern century unfolded right before my eyes. Derek, the man who had just claimed he was discharged early due to severe physical trauma, reached down and unbuckled the safety straps of his bulky metal wheelchair. He did not wince. He did not groan. He simply stood up. His posture was perfectly straight, entirely devoid of the crippling pain he had been violently pantomiming just moments ago. He casually adjusted the fabric of his sling. The charade was officially over. He believed the trap was already sprung. He walked confidently out of the dining room, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Monica stayed behind, glaring down at the dark red stain soaking into her pristine white shoes. "You always were a clumsy old fool," she muttered, dropping the loving wife act completely. I kept my eyes fixed on the arched doorway leading into the front hall, listening intently to the sound of Derek pulling the heavy wooden door open. He expected to see a corrupt state notary standing on the porch. He expected the final piece of his flawless puzzle to neatly lock into place. Instead, a booming voice shattered the quiet evening air, instantly draining every ounce of arrogance from my son. Derek Caldwell, the deep voice commanded, echoing with uncompromising power. "Step back into the house and keep your hands exactly where I can see them." I heard Derek gasp, a sharp, ragged sound of pure terror. The heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical combat boots flooded into the foyer. Monica dropped the crystal wine glass she was holding. It shattered against the table, but neither of us looked at the mess. I slowly pushed my chair back and walked deliberately into the front hallway. The sight that greeted me was absolutely glorious. Derek was backing away from the open doorway, his face completely drained of blood. Standing on my front porch, perfectly framed by the fading evening light, was Benjamin Wright. My fiercely loyal attorney looked like an avenging angel. Flanking him on his left was Garrett Flynn, holding a legally certified warrant. And pouring through the doorway, forming an impenetrable wall of federal authority, were 6 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They wore dark tactical vests, clearly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of their agency. Derek stumbled backward, his back hitting the hallway wall with a dull thud. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking wildly. "Who are you people? You cannot just barge into my home." Benjamin stepped over the threshold, his eyes locking onto Derek with profound disgust. "This is not your home," Derek Benjamin stated, his voice ringing with undeniable clarity. "And it never will be." The lead federal agent stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his tactical belt. "Derek Caldwell," the agent declared, his voice booming. "You are under arrest for federal fraud, grand larceny, systemic extortion, and severe elder abuse." Total panic instantly consumed the hallway. Monica let out a piercing scream from the dining room, completely abandoning her elegant facade. She hitched up her white dress and sprinted toward the rear of the house, desperately aiming for the kitchen door. She did not make it past the refrigerator. 2 agents had already secured the perimeter. The kitchen door swung open, and an agent stepped into her path. Monica slammed into him, shrieking, flailing her hands in a blind attempt to escape. The agent grabbed her wrists, spun her around, and slammed her against the granite countertops my money paid for. The metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly. Derek watched his wife get restrained, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He looked frantically around the hallway, searching desperately for an exit, but he was completely surrounded. He looked at Benjamin, then at Garrett, and finally his panicked gaze locked onto me. I was standing near the archway, playing the confused victim one final time. "Dad." Derek screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Tell them to stop. These people are intruders. I am your legal guardian. You are sick. You have severe dementia. You do not understand what is happening." He turned to the lead agent, spitting his desperate lies. "You cannot listen to him. My father is completely delusional. He is highly aggressive. Call Dr. Aris immediately. My father requires a psychiatric hold right now." I listened to the pathetic desperation in his voice. He truly believed he could talk his way out of a federal raid. I took a deep breath, feeling the remaining shreds of my paternal grief evaporate. The frail, exhausted old man who walked through the front door completely vanished. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back until I stood at my imposing height. I leveled my gaze directly at my son, letting him see the cold, hardened contractor who had spent 40 years commanding chaotic construction sites. Derek's rambling excuses died in his throat as he watched my physical transformation. The false weakness in my hands disappeared. I reached into the front pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out the small black digital audio receiver. I held it up, letting the green light illuminate the dark hallway. The silence was absolute, broken only by Monica's muffled sobbing. I looked Derek directly in the eyes, my stare burning with the intensity of a blazing forge. So I pressed the play button on the device. The audio was crystal clear, amplified in the quiet foyer. Derek's own arrogant voice echoed loudly off the painted walls. "The old man is useless now." The recording played, the venom filling the space. "All he knows how to do is hammer nails and pour dirty concrete. He is a pathetic, outdated relic who belongs in a locked ward. He will not see this coming until the orderly is strapping him into a straitjacket." I clicked the device off. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. Derek stared at the small black box, his jaw trembling, his eyes welling with the agonizing realization that his entire empire was utterly destroyed. He knew in that exact second that I had heard every single word. I walked across the hardwood floor, closing the distance, until I was standing just inches from his trembling face. "I built this house, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Every single wall, every structural beam, and every hidden wire. Did you really think you could lock me out of my own creation?" The fallout from that night was remarkably swift and incredibly brutal. The federal agents completely dismantled my son's criminal syndicate before the morning sun even touched the horizon. Faced with the overwhelming, undeniable evidence we had meticulously gathered, Dr. Aris immediately panicked. He aggressively flipped on Derek to save his own pathetic career, eagerly signing a comprehensive plea deal that detailed every single fraudulent medical evaluation and forged guardianship order they had forcefully executed over the past 3 years. He willingly surrendered his medical license without a fight, completely exposing the dark underbelly of his entire medical practice. His cowardly confession was the ultimate final nail in their carefully crafted coffins. During the highly publicized federal trial, the full sickening scope of their extensive operation was laid entirely bare for the whole world to witness in absolute horror. The diligent jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Derek and Monica were formally indicted on 40 separate counts of federal racketeering, grand larceny, and severe elder abuse. The federal judge, a stern man completely immune to Derek's local municipal influence, sentenced them both to 20 years in federal prison without the slight possibility of parole. They were utterly ruined. There were no tears left in my tired eyes as I watched the armed bailiffs lead my son out of the silent courtroom in heavy steel chains. He had made his treacherous choices, and the universe was finally delivering the unyielding consequences. The federal authorities systematically seized every single offshore bank account and shadow corporation Derek had constructed. The stolen millions were meticulously tracked and safely returned to the rightful owners. My massive retirement portfolio was fully restored, secure, and entirely under my absolute control. But I no longer looked at my personal wealth the same way. The horrifying ordeal had fundamentally shifted my entire perspective on life forever. With Benjamin Wright proudly serving as the lead legal director, I took a massive portion of my restored fortune and officially established the Martha Caldwell Foundation. We built a robust, aggressive legal task force entirely dedicated to providing free, immediate protection for vulnerable elderly victims trapped in fraudulent guardianship schemes. We effectively became the impenetrable shield that innocent people like Sylvia desperately needed to combat systematic corporate greed. It has been 2 peaceful years since that terrible Friday night. Today, the summer air is wonderfully warm and filled with the gentle hum of cicadas. I am sitting comfortably in a plush wooden rocking chair on the wide wrap-around porch of the Oak Ridge Sanctuary. We completely bought out the corrupt psychiatric black site facility, thoroughly gutted the entire management staff, and beautifully transformed it into a world-class care facility fully funded by the foundation. Beside me, sipping a tall glass of fresh iced tea, sits Sylvia Bennett. She is no longer the frail, terrified prisoner we discovered shivering in the dark. She has fully regained her physical strength, her remarkably sharp wit, and her vibrant human dignity. She turns her face toward the bright sunshine, completely free, and offers me a warm, genuinely beautiful smile. I smile back, leaning deep into the steady rhythm of the rocking chair. Looking out over the lush, manicured gardens, a profound sense of quiet clarity washes completely over my soul. For 40 long years, I truly believed my ultimate purpose was merely constructing walls and pouring concrete to build strong houses. Now I finally understand the undeniable truth. My true life's work was never just about building the physical houses. It was always about finding the strength to protect the innocent people living safely inside them. They are my truest legacy, and no one will ever take that away from me. This beautifully restored sanctuary stands as a permanent testament to survival, to justice, and to the unbreakable power of standing your ground against overwhelming evil. We are finally completely safe and entirely at absolute peace. The darkest betrayals often come wrapped in a warm smile from those we blindly trust the most. We are constantly taught that family is an unbreakable sacred bond, but shared blood does not ever excuse cruel manipulation, nor does advancing age imply acceptable weakness. True strength lies within the unwavering courage to face devastating reality, to fiercely trust your own instincts when something feels intrinsically wrong, and to set utterly impenetrable boundaries. Never allow anyone to diminish your inherent worth or strip you of your human dignity. Your profound wisdom and hard-earned experience are your absolute greatest defensive weapons. If Harrison's fight for absolute justice kept you right on the edge of your seat, hit the like button and subscribe. Have you ever had to stand up against someone you completely trusted? Share your personal story in the comments below. I read every single one. See you next time.